She was fired for blowing bubbles. Just bubbles, no words, no noise. Just one quiet moment with a little boy sitting alone on the floor. But the next day, that boy, who hadn't said a single word in over 2 years, opened his mouth and spoke. Not to his father, not to a therapist, to her, the maid who had already been dismissed and forgotten. That's when everything changed. The rules, the silence, the idea of who was allowed to matter. Because in a world of money, perfection, and control, one quiet woman did the one thing no one else could. She reached him. And it all started with a bubble. Esther Abraham didn't look like someone meant to change a life. She had only been in Manhattan for a week. New city, new job, new name on her uniform. She was quiet, careful, deliberate. The kind of person people looked past without ever seeing. Joshua Hill's penthouse sat 35 stories above the noise. 5,000 square feet of polished stone, imported marble, and silence so thick it felt like glass. Nothing moved unless scheduled. Nothing touched unless authorized. Lucas, Joshua's 6-year-old son, lived in that silence. He didn't speak. Not to his father, not to anyone. Not since the day his mother died. And no one was allowed near him, especially not the staff. Esther understood the rules. She followed them. But on her 4th day, she was wiping down the living room windows when she saw him. Small, still, sitting cross-legged on the rug, just staring through the glass like he was waiting for something that never came. She kept cleaning. She didn't say a word. But something about that moment pulled at her. Something soft, something old. A memory of summers back in Jersey. Porch steps, cheap soap. Her cousins blowing bubbles into the air like little prayers, hoping they'd float high enough to be heard. Esther reached into her apron, quietly. She dipped a tiny wand into the edge of her cleaning bucket, brought it to her lips, and blew. One bubble. It drifted slowly through the still air, light, silent, meaningless to anyone else, but not to him. She didn't look at Lucas. She didn't speak. She just stood there, still, letting the bubble float. And from the corner of her eye, she saw it. His face moved, just barely. His eyes followed the bubble. And then, the corners of his mouth lifted. A smile. Esther didn't react. She didn't break the silence. She only dipped the wand again and let another one go. Behind a thick glass door, Joshua Hill sat in his home office, scanning financial reports, until a flicker from the security feed caught his eye. His son, smiling, not flinching, not hiding, smiling. He leaned in closer to the screen, and there, just behind him, was Esther, gloved, silent, blowing bubbles. Joshua's hand tightened around his coffee cup. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, and he didn't yet know. He had just witnessed the most important moment of his son's life. But before we begin, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story reminds you that the smallest moments often carry the loudest meaning. While the world outside chased noise and numbers, inside that penthouse, time moved like it had forgotten how. The cleaning list was long. It always was. Esther didn't mind. She was used to being invisible. She moved like background music. Steady, quiet, never too close to anything that breathed. The penthouse was marble, glass, and absence. Everything had its place. Everything except for Lucas. No one warned her what it would feel like, to clean around a child who never looked up, to sweep past toys that were never played with, to hear silence so full it almost echoed. Lucas sat on the living room rug again that morning, the same way he had the day before. Cross-legged, hands in his lap, eyes fixed on something only he could see. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't seem to notice anyone existed. Esther didn't speak either. She wasn't allowed to. No one on staff was. But something about the stillness pressed on her chest. She finished dusting the table, wiped her gloves on her apron, and stood by the window. The light was warm through the glass. Outside, the city buzzed. Inside, it was a museum, still clean and untouched. And then, she remembered, Jersey summers, sticky air, soap bubbles in a chipped mug. Her cousin laughing so hard she fell off the porch. Esther blinked, reached slowly into the pocket of her apron, and pulled out a small unused bubble wand she kept for scenting the room with lavender mist. She dipped it carefully into the edge of her cleaning bucket. She didn't look at Lucas. She didn't try to make it a moment. She just blew. A single bubble lifted from the wand, gliding through the room like it didn't know it didn't belong. It floated toward the window, caught a beam of light, and shimmered. From the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shift, a soft turn of the boy's head. His eyes tracked the bubble. No blinking, no twitching, just following. She stayed still, breath quiet, the wand in her hand, still dripping. Then, a sound, small, barely there. A giggle. Esther's throat tightened. She said nothing. She blew another. This time the bubble drifted lower, spun and popped just above his knees. Lucas smiled. Not a big, cartoon smile. A quiet one. Honest. Unforced. Like the corners of his mouth had just remembered how to lift. Esther didn't move, didn't speak. She only stepped back gently and went back to cleaning. But something had already shifted. In him. In her. She didn't know that down the hall behind a glass-paneled office, Joshua Hill was staring at a security monitor. He had paused mid-meeting, confused by what he'd seen. His son, laughing, reaching, watching. The maid, blowing bubbles. Joshua narrowed his eyes, and somewhere inside the man who thought he had everything under control. Something cracked. It happened fast. No warning, no conversation. Just a call through the earpiece. "Mr. Hill wants to see you. Now." Esther wiped her gloves on her apron. Her chest tightened, not from fear, but something heavier. She'd only been here 4 days. She hadn't touched anything fragile, hadn't spoken out of turn. But when she stepped into the office, she knew. Joshua Hill stood by the window, arms folded, jaw tight. Behind him, the skyline stretched in silence, glittering, indifferent. On the desk, a still frame paused on the security feed. Lucas, smiling, a bubble mid-air. Esther, just behind him. "You're done," Joshua said without looking at her. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Esther stood still, hands at her sides. She didn't ask why. She already knew. "You're not a therapist," he continued. "You're a maid. You were hired to clean, not whatever that was." His words didn't sting, not yet. But the finality in them did. Esther nodded once, not a protest, not an apology, just acknowledgement. He waited for her to explain. She didn't. Because what could she say? That a boy who hadn't smiled in years followed a bubble like it carried his name. That silence responded to presence, not permission. There were no words for that. Joshua looked at her like she was the problem, like the sight of his son laughing had offended him. "Pack your things," he said more quietly this time. "You'll be escorted out." Still, she didn't speak. She just turned, calmly, and walked out. No slam of the door, no final look. Just her footsteps, soft, slow, steady, fading down the hall. She passed the kitchen, the gleaming floors, the hallway where voices were always hushed. At the foot of the staircase, a shape moved. Lucas. Half hidden behind the banister, his small hand gripping the rail, eyes fixed on her. He didn't smile, didn't giggle, just watched her. Still, like stone. Esther paused. Her eyes met his, just for a second. Then she lowered her gaze, picked up her mop and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed without a sound. Upstairs, Joshua remained by the window, arms crossed. He told himself he'd done the right thing, maintaining structure, enforcing boundaries, protecting his son's care plan. That's what he told himself. But down in the lobby, as the elevator doors slid open, Esther stepped out into the cold marble, alone. And upstairs, in a penthouse built for perfection, Lucas sat by the window again, waiting. The house felt different the next morning, quieter, but not the peaceful kind, the kind that pressed against the walls like something missing. No one mentioned her name. They never did. Staff moved carefully as if afraid the silence might shatter. Lucas didn't come to the living room, didn't sit by the window, didn't wait on the rug. He stayed upstairs, didn't eat breakfast, refused the therapist's flashcards, refused eye contact. The specialist noted it as emotional fatigue. Joshua called it a phase. But by day 3, Lucas was under the dining table again, curled tight, hands over his ears, rocking back and forth in a rhythm that didn't ask to be interrupted. No one could reach him, not the behaviorist, not the occupational therapist flown in from Boston, not even Joshua, who stood outside the room each morning, watching from the threshold like a man waiting to be invited into his own child's world. But Lucas didn't invite anyone. He stayed wrapped in silence, and the house returned to what it had always been: cold, beautiful, orderly, empty. Late one night, when even the city outside had quieted, Joshua sat alone in his office. The lights were low, a half-finished drink on the table, his tie undone. He pulled up the archived footage from 4 days ago, clicked play. There she was, Esther, kneeling by the window, gloved, still, saying nothing, and Lucas, watching, smiling, reaching out toward a floating bubble like it was the only thing in the world soft enough to trust. Joshua replayed that moment, again and again. He watched his son giggle, not flinch, not retreat, not hide. He watched the maid say nothing, demand nothing, praise nothing. She had just been there, and that had been enough. The footage ended. Joshua sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on the dark screen. He had spent over $40,000 that month on therapy. Not one word, not one smile. And yet, in a single unspoken moment, his son had reached for a stranger. Not because she tried, but because she didn't. She hadn't broken a rule, she'd broken through. Downstairs, Lucas sat on the rug again, same spot, same window, hands in his lap. But the space beside him stayed empty. No quiet footsteps, no bucket, no bubbles, just silence. He didn't cry, he didn't rock, he just sat, still. Waiting for something no one else seemed to notice was gone. And in that perfect, polished penthouse, the absence finally made more noise than the boy ever had. He didn't mean to drive there. Joshua had spent the morning pacing his office, phone in one hand, silence in the other. Therapists gave updates that meant nothing. Behavioral withdrawal, emotional dissociation, all words, all expensive, but none of them could explain why his son had started hiding again, why the light in Lucas's eyes had dimmed, why the boy had gone back to waiting, like someone never came back. Joshua opened the archived footage one more time. Just once more, he told himself. But this time he didn't watch the boy. He watched her. The way Esther moved, slow, grounded, never intrusive. The way she kept her distance, like she knew she wasn't part of the story, but hoped to be near it. He paused the screen, zoomed in on her face. There was no performance in it, no agenda, just presence. He didn't pack a bag, didn't call ahead. He just got in the car. Harlem was loud, raw, alive in a way the penthouse would never be. The address wasn't on file. He wasn't sure how he got it. Maybe someone on staff. Maybe he'd paid someone without realizing it. But there she was. Esther opened the door in a sweatshirt and socks. No apron, no gloves. She didn't look surprised to see him, only tired. He didn't speak at first, didn't know how. Then finally, "I need you back." The words came out sharper than he meant. Esther raised one eyebrow. "I'm not a therapist." "I know," he said. He ran a hand over the back of his neck, eyes dropping to the floor. "That's kind of the point." The silence between them stretched. Esther leaned slightly against the doorway, folding her arms. "Lucas doesn't talk to people," Joshua said. "But he looked at you, he smiled. I don't know why, and I don't need to. I just need you back in that house." She didn't blink, didn't soften, just studied him, like she was deciding if he'd earned that sentence. After a long pause, she stepped aside. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Early." The next day, the penthouse door opened at 7:02 a.m. No one announced her. No one needed to. Esther moved like she always had, quietly, deliberately, like she belonged to the silence. Lucas was already waiting, cross-legged, same spot, same window, eyes fixed forward like he knew. Esther said nothing. She didn't reach for him, didn't ask anything of him. She knelt, slow and careful, pulled the wand from her apron pocket and dipped it into the bucket. One breath, one bubble. It floated into the air, soft and slow, catching the morning light like it had been waiting for this exact moment. Lucas followed it with his eyes. Then he smiled. A real smile this time. Not a flicker, not a test, but something solid. Present. Joshua watched from the hallway. He didn't step in. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching the woman he had once fired become the first safe place his son had ever chosen. They didn't call it progress. There were no charts, no clipboards, no morning briefings, just a bubble, a smile, and a boy who didn't run away when she entered the room. Esther didn't try to win him over. She didn't ask for eye contact or offer praise when it came. She simply stayed near, present, unmoving, gentle. Sometimes she'd sit on the rug, a small distance away. Sometimes she wouldn't sit at all. But every time, without fail, she brought the bucket and the bubbles. Lucas began to wait for them. He never said it, never pointed. But he was there before she was, cross-legged by the window, hands folded in his lap like he had something sacred to return to. The rhythm between them was never spoken. Esther would blow one bubble, wait, then another. Sometimes he'd reach for them, sometimes he wouldn't. It didn't matter, because the space between them wasn't filled with demands. It was filled with trust. By the third morning, something shifted. Lucas leaned forward, not a lot, just an inch, and scooted slightly closer. Esther noticed. Didn't meet him with a smile or a word. She just blew another bubble and let it drift. The next day he scooted again, a little closer, then again. By the end of the week, the space between them was a shared one. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. One afternoon, the sun stretched long across the rug. The city was quiet beneath them. Esther sat cross-legged, a wand in one hand, her bucket beside her. Lucas reached out, slow, careful, and touched the surface of a rising bubble. It popped beneath his fingertip, and then he laughed, soft, honest, like it had surprised even him. Esther didn't react too much. She didn't make it a big moment. She just placed her hand gently on the rug beside him. And that's when it happened. Lucas turned toward her, looked at her, opened his mouth, and whispered, "Pop." One word, soft as air, but it landed in the room like thunder. Esther didn't move, didn't cry, didn't reach for him. She only looked at him, steady and kind, and said, "That's okay." Behind them in the hallway, Joshua froze. He hadn't meant to watch, but he had. He dropped his coffee. The mug shattered against the floor. The noise startled Lucas. He flinched. His hands shot to his ears, but Esther moved before the fear could settle. She turned toward him, slowly, placed her body between him and the hallway, and whispered, "It's just a cup. You're safe." Her voice was calm, grounded, certain. Lucas blinked, lowered his hands, let out a breath. Joshua stood frozen by the wall. His chest was tight, his hands shaking, because for the first time in years, his son had said a word, and it hadn't been for him. The whispers started small, a passing comment on a quarterly call, a question slipped into a lunch meeting. "Josh, is it true you've got your cleaning staff doing therapy now?" He brushed it off at first, laughed, shrugged. "They're just playing, it's nothing formal." But the questions kept coming, and the tone changed. "She's unlicensed." "Is this even legal?" What happens if your son regresses? By the end of the week, the board called a private meeting. The room was glass and marble, as like the rest of his world. Men in suits, women with tablets, smiles polished sharp. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. One of them leaned forward, fingers laced. "We know this is difficult, Josh, but entrusting a vulnerable child to a maid, it's reckless." Another chimed in. "You've invested over $500,000 in certified care, and now we're hearing your son's progress is tied to someone with no credentials." He didn't respond, not right away. He thought about Lucas, kneeling by the window, reaching for bubbles like they were the only safe thing in the world. He thought about the word pop, the laugh, the smile, the way Esther didn't flinch when his son did. And then he said calmly, "My son said a word." The room paused. Joshua looked around the table. For 2 years, not one of your specialists got him to speak. Not one program, not one chart. But this woman, the one you keep calling the maid, she did. Someone tried to cut in, but he raised a hand. She didn't diagnose him. She didn't push him. She just showed up. And for the first time in years, he let someone in. The silence that followed wasn't agreement. It was distance. They would never understand. Not really. Outside that boardroom, in a very different kind of space, Esther knelt beside Lucas with a handful of crayons. No cameras, no funding, no approval, just color and quiet. Lucas had begun placing his crayons in groups, red beside yellow, blue beside green. No one told him to. No one asked why. It was his language. Esther didn't comment. She didn't ask what it meant. She just mirrored his rhythm, arranging her own small pile beside his, slowly, gently. Lucas looked at her, not confused, not scared, just present. He handed her a crayon. She took it without a word, and beside them on the rug, the bubble wand rested, waiting. Joshua stood in the hallway again that night. Same place, same angle. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer watched to monitor. He watched to learn, to understand what it meant to show up without fixing, to love without control, to witness without needing a name for everything. Inside the room, Esther didn't speak, but everything about her said, "I'm here. I see him. I'll stay." The day started like the others. Soft light, crayons on the floor, a quiet boy waiting beside the window. Esther arrived at exactly 7:02. No fanfare, no noise. She placed her bucket down, sat cross-legged on the rug, and gave him space. Lucas was already drawing, short, deliberate strokes, one crayon at a time. He didn't look up when she sat beside him, but he moved his drawing closer. Esther waited. She didn't ask what it was. She never did. But today, he showed her. 3 stick figures. One tall, one small, one with a swirl of lines for curly hair. Above them, a red sun. Below, scrawled in jagged letters, "Mom." Esther's breath caught, not visibly, not loud, but enough that she had to blink hard before she moved. She didn't ask questions. She didn't praise. She only placed her hand beside his and whispered, "She must have been very kind." Lucas nodded once, tiny, precise, and then he reached for the bubble wand. Esther hesitated. It had always been hers, the thing she brought, the thing she used to break the silence, but now he was asking to share it. She dipped the wand into the bucket, lifted it slowly, blew one careful bubble into the air. It rose, slow, graceful, floating toward the high ceiling like it had a secret to carry. Lucas followed it with his eyes. Then, suddenly, softly, he spoke. Bubble. The word was whole, clear, not whispered, not guessed, spoken. Esther didn't move. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gasp or reach for her phone. She just looked at him, calm, steady, and said, "Would you like to blow one?" Lucas smiled, and for the first time, he nodded with confidence. She handed him the wand. He dipped it clumsily, lifted it too fast. The liquid splattered, but she didn't correct him. She waited. He tried again, and on the third try, a bubble formed, wobbly, imperfect, but beautiful. It rose into the air, dipped slightly, and floated toward the kitchen window. Joshua had been watching from the hallway, not like before, not as a man overseeing progress, but as a father, rooted in a moment he couldn't believe was real. When the word left his son's mouth, his knees nearly gave out. His hand slipped against the doorframe, and in the quiet shock of it all, he dropped the glass in his hand. It shattered against the hardwood. Lucas flinched, his body tensed, his hands flew to his ears. But Esther moved before the fear could settle. She turned, placed her body between Lucas and the broken sound, and said softly, "It's just a cup. You're safe." Her voice wrapped around the boy like arms. And slowly, he breathed again. Joshua stood frozen. The mug lay shattered. But so did something else inside him, because what he'd just witnessed wasn't therapy, wasn't strategy. It was love, simple, untrained, uninvited, and utterly, completely real. It started with a letter, cream-colored, hand-delivered, stamped by a Manhattan law firm that specialized in family transitions. Joshua read it 3 times. Emergency petition for custody, filed by Lucas's maternal grandparents, citing neglect, unqualified supervision, and a claim that he had outsourced the care of a grieving, developmentally delayed child to a MAID. The words burned, but what struck him most wasn't the language. It was the timing. Lucas had just begun to speak, and now someone was trying to take him away. The hearing came fast. The press caught wind before the ink was dry. Billionaire father under fire. Is this what autism therapy looks like now? Joshua arrived in a tailored suit, circles under his eyes. Esther came by train in the same coat she wore to work. She didn't sit beside him. She sat 2 rows back. Uninvited, but there, as always. Inside the courtroom, the air was sterile. A judge, 2 attorneys, Lucas's grandparents across the aisle, polished, composed, grief hardening their edges. He needs structure, their lawyer argued. He needs certified care, not casual companionship. Joshua said nothing at first. He didn't speak of specialists or progress reports. He simply stood, turned toward the judge and said, "My son didn't speak for over 2 years, not to me, not to anyone." And then one day, a woman sat beside him, didn't talk, didn't touch. She just blew a bubble, and my son smiled. And then he spoke, not because she treated him like a case, but because she treated him like a person. There was no reaction in the room, just note-taking, clock-watching, the kind of silence that didn't care about feelings, only facts. The judge asked one final question. "Is the child present?" Joshua hesitated, then nodded. Lucas was led into the room by a court-appointed child advocate. Tiny suit, nervous eyes. The space was too bright, too big. He clutched a crayon in his hand. The judge leaned forward. "Lucas," she said gently, "can I ask you something?" He didn't respond. The judge waited, then tried again. "Can you tell me who makes you feel safe?" Lucas looked around, eyes scanning the room, skipping past his grandparents, past his father, past everyone, until he saw her. Esther, sitting quietly, hands folded, not moving. Lucas stepped forward, walked past the bench, past the lawyers. He climbed the single step to the witness chair. Leaning in close to the microphone, he whispered one word. Bubbles. That was it. But it was enough. The court recessed. Custody remained with Joshua, but the real verdict came later, when Lucas walked out of the building, took Esther's hand without being told, and placed the crayon in her palm like a gift. No one clapped. No one cheered. But Joshua stood behind them, heart heavy in his chest, realizing, sometimes family isn't decided by law. It's chosen, in moments that no one else sees. It didn't happen all at once. There was no ribbon cutting, no press release, no grand unveiling, just a quiet morning, in a quiet building on a quiet street in Brooklyn. A small space with soft floors, wide windows, and walls painted the color of calm. There were no desks, no uniforms, no clocks. Just shelves filled with crayons, baskets of bubbles, and silence, the safe kind. They called it the place, not a clinic, not a school, just a place. For children like Lucas, for parents like Joshua, for women like Esther. It started with 3 of them. One child who had been waiting to be heard, one father who finally listened, and one woman who never tried to fix what was never broken. They didn't have credentials, but they had proof. The kind you can't print in a report, the kind you feel in your chest when a child who never made eye contact reaches for your hand. The kind you can't buy, can't outsource, can't explain, only witness. Lucas came every day. Sometimes he didn't. No one measured his words. Some days he just drew. One morning he sketched 3 stick figures again, this time in full color, one tall, one with curly hair, one small. They were standing under a big red sun, and above them, in yellow crayon, he'd written, "Home." Joshua stared at it for a long time, not because he didn't understand it, but because finally he did. Later that afternoon, Lucas sat on the patio with Esther. They were blowing bubbles, one at a time, just like before. He sat close now, closer than he ever had, shoulder touching shoulder. One bubble rose higher than the rest. It floated, tilted, caught a breeze, and began drifting toward the sky. Lucas tracked it with his eyes. Then softly he whispered, "That one's for Mum." Esther didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just placed her hand gently on his back and let the moment live. Joshua stood a few feet away, watching them. He didn't call her staff anymore, didn't call her the maid. He didn't call her anything at all. He just stood beside her. Because labels didn't matter here. Not anymore. What mattered was this: that a boy who had once lived in silence now chose who he let into his world. And that woman, the one no one expected, had become the bridge. Lucas never called her Mom, but one morning, while reaching for the bubbles, he whispered something new. "Miss Esther." And that was enough.